All right. Hello. This is a launch of a brand new podcast here. Formerly, what was called the ROTB pod is now the Redbird Reboot. Just like the Arizona Cardinals, we are rebooting podcast with a new look of some more branding, more stuff up soon at least. Thank you guys for those who followed along with the ROTB pod. Been off for a few months. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the journey here, talk a bit about the state of the cards where we are seeing them right now. Right now, I'd say at least what Cardinals fans want to talk about is, of course, the draft. I'm going to go over a bit of that, go catch up a little bit on the season. But for the most part, where have I been? A lot of it has ultimately been trying to get stuff set up here amidst a busy schedule. The Cardinals also went through a pretty hectic offseason. Both their head coach, the general manager, some controversy, obviously, with a lot of reports, at least from Terry McDonough. There's been a huge push as far as the team's uniforms were concerned. Oh, man, there's just been so much that's been happening, going on. I think we can probably start at least overall at the beginning, which is moving on from Cliff and Keim. Cardinals are entering a new era. You see head coach Jonathan Gannon bringing in some guys. GM Monty Ossenfort will be overhauling the scouting department, more likely after we see the team come back from the break, getting things set up. So let's go ahead and talk at least a bit overall about where the Cardinals currently. And the biggest area is that the Cardinals are a team that, in my opinion, have given themselves a bunch of gifts, but they're not going to be opening it until next year. And you can see at least that in any of the Super Bowl odds all over the place, projected to have the number 1 pick, projected in some places to have the number 2 pick, thanks to the Houston Texans. And it's a place at least where I think what you want to look at is ultimately a reboot, not just of the team, not just of the players, but ultimately of the culture. So with today and everything going on, I figured we could start and do things a little bit different than most orders. We're going to start with looking at Arizona's current depth chart and some of the offseason stories. We'll go through all of that and then talk a little bit about what I anticipate for the team on the season and a little bit about all this 2024 stuff, which has been kind of hitting, at least with Arizona and the state of their roster. So let's go ahead first and bring up the biggest upcoming topic, which is the wide receiver position. DeAndre Hopkins not traded by the Arizona Cardinals. It's going to be interesting to see, at least for if he actually takes a snap with the team, if he takes snaps through half the season. Right now, with Kyler Murray coming off of that ACL injury, there's been some people projected him for week 1. Some have projected in November. Smart money seems to be pushing it back a little bit, given the time frame, the recovery, Murray's ability to run. So it's interesting that Hopkins is returning. Now, we can talk at least anything about the offseason, which he said, who says I want to be elsewhere. The biggest thing, at least, is DeAndre Hopkins himself essentially brought up those trade rumors. Didn't say anything, at least specifically, about demanding a trade request. He did, however, give teams he wanted to be traded to, wanted to go to a winner. And end of the day, he did not end up actually getting his wish. So we'll find out exactly what that's going to look like. But one of the things that I do want to bring up with Hopkins is that the team ultimately, for the entire offseason, was best off keeping him. Because ultimately, it costs them quite a bit to trade him. Teams were clearly not willing to be able to pay up for him. And I wanted to take at least a look here with how that functions within the salary cap. DeAndre Hopkins currently, he has the most dead money on the team. He's got the highest overall salary. Kyler Murray is looking at just about a $16 million cap number. That's one of the things that I think you can be able to look at here. I feel like a lot of fans ultimately have kind of moved on from DeAndre Hopkins before the draft. So for him to actually be still on the team now, we've gone through at least what it would look like for them to be able to trade him. It would probably be a post 6-1 trade. You'd be able to save probably about that $19 million as his base salary. You'd take on $10 million in dead cap. And when you consider the Arizona Cardinals ultimately have probably the 5th most cap space in the NFL. Now, clearly, when draft picks are signed, this will go down. But this year's not necessarily been about cap as far as it comes to with cap savings, getting back under. It's been, in many ways, about cap for 2024. So what you're seeing, I think, here is Cardinals fans, we love to talk about the current season. We don't like to think about 2024 until it gets to 2024. Some of that, I think, is under the previous regime and Steve Keim. They had a lot that they did as far as just going year to year. Everything that they did would be just focus on 1 year. Next year is next year's problem. You have a different approach with Monty Ossenfort. And this approach is one which involves draft picks. It involves being able to recognize that you'll have to add guys this year to be able to have them take over not just next year, but potentially in the next year or two, while at the same time not necessarily having to fill every single hole on the roster, which I think is key. Another player who asked for a trade request, Budda Baker, and then the other player, at least, who's had a lot of stuff swirling around, at least, with Kyler Murray coming off an ACL. You can take a look here just at the top section of this team, and the question I think a lot of Cardinals fans, and this is where I think we can be maybe more biased, maybe more liking players. Maybe we can be a little too attached to players because the team would just consistently in the desert not be as good. But you look at the top part of their roster, and with Hopkins and Baker have both wanted out, both don't seem to be getting traded yet. You can see how Kyler Murray, his status, at least for the start of the year, is in doubt. His status in 2024. There's many people already calling it into question. Marquise Brown, he's in the fifth-year option, and he has essentially just a $13 million base salary, nothing else. And then we get into the nitty-gritty, which is DJ Humphries and Isaiah Simmons. And this reflects itself in the Cardinals draft this year because DJ Humphries at age 30, they essentially can get out of his contract as of next year. They can't necessarily cut him this year, can't necessarily even trade him this year. But one thing we know about Humphries is he's struggling. He has a bad back. Currently, he's not been healthy. There's been questions about his knee that he's gotten injured a few times. Ultimately, with the NFL, it comes down to there are some players who you can count on year in and year out until you can't. There are other players who essentially it's kind of on a year-to-year basis. And that's okay, I think, to accept a lot of times that sometimes you have to be able to take a down year, 1 year, come back stronger another year. With the Cardinals, we're probably talking about 2 years, if we're being honest, depending on what happens with Kyler Murray in this new era and new scheme. Now, Zach Ertz coming off an ACL, James Conner, a 28-year-old running back. They only have a sixth-round rookie after him, and Isaiah Simmons did not get his fifth-year option picked up. I think the core of all of this put together will tell you that the Cardinals in 2024 and the Cardinals of 2022 may look like polar, completely different teams. And the reason why is simple. Most of the players that Steve Keim, when he had signed, their deals are either up in 2024, DeAndre Hopkins, or they're going to have a lot better ability to save some cap by cutting guys. The biggest thing, at least overall, is that you look at how the team is built with young players as far as for core parts of their team, as far as stars, guys who are going to be here for a while. How many of the Cardinals players currently are signed through the 2025 season? So you're talking about draft picks from any time from 2013, 2014, 2015, maybe 2017 until now. Signed for this year, next year, and the year after, where you talk about stars. It's very clear, at least, that when Steve Keim structured, he put everything into essentially 2-year window, pushes stuff back into year 3 to take up some of the remaining cap room. Monty Ossenfort, on the other hand, he's burying it and raising it down to the studs. And I think a lot of people have understood that, but maybe not to the degree that we may think. Because in 2025, you essentially, if you assume by that point with the Cardinals drafting offensive tackle that Humphries is gone, Zach Ertz still has money, but at the end of the day, the oldest players on the team would be Kyler, Jalen Thompson. There wouldn't be a single player from before the 2019 NFL draft that would make it to 2025 besides the quarterback. Now, that some people may call that absurd. On the other hand, it is sort of the way of the NFL to see these quick teams being able to turn around. But at the end of the day, you still have star players. You still have core players that are able to last through long periods of time. You can look at, obviously, Larry Fitzgerald, Cardinals GOAT. But it goes further than that. It goes further with guys like Calais Campbell, guys like a Chandler Jones. There were blue chip star players that the Cardinals had that were able to last multiple regimes. And then the question comes, how many of those players do you have right now on your team that are not from the current draft? And when you look at it, essentially, I think that's where the team has been building all along has been. It's essentially Kyler and not much else. DeAndre Hopkins, contract is up. Budda Baker, contract is up. Cardinals clearly have not extended either player yet, despite them having earned it. Both players have asked for trades. You're in a place where essentially you're kind of taking a look at the house. You're looking at the structure. And the question is that foundation set? Like happens all the time. Teams will simply take a foundational piece like Aaron Rodgers, move out the coach, the GM, keep moving forward. Tom Brady, foundational piece, moves to a different team. The Cardinals don't have a lot of foundational pieces. And that's where I think that it will be interesting to see how this corresponds with their general manager, with their head coach, how much time that they get, because there's a lot of questions, at least here with Jonathan Gannon and with their head coach. There's a lot of questions, at least, about owner Michael Bidwell. But instead of talking about 2020, let's talk about something a little bit more optimistic. We'll go through the Cardinals depth chart here and spend some time on the draft. We already talked about Hopkins. Michael Wilson, Cardinals third-round pick, selected here at pick 96, I believe, from the factor that the Cardinals ended up having a sanction, tampering charge, whatever you want to call it. Arizona moves from pick 66 back to 96. And they do pick up one of the guys who, in my opinion, at least, is one of the few X-receivers in this draft. As far as his size, his height, his ability, Michael Wilson is one of those players. We'll take a look at his mock draft, which is one of the ways that I like to be able to look at a player, talk about it's not just athleticism, but being able to look at least who are comparable players. Michael Wilson is one of those guys who has the height-weight combo. He doesn't have the shiftiness combo, but he's got the explosiveness that you can see here at the broad jump. So if you look at some of the different players that pop up, the biggest thing you can think of, at least with these guys who are receivers, who have the big, who have the size, who don't necessarily have the speed, you're talking about a guy who at least is able to, for the most part, maybe not be your wide receiver one, but a guy who can line up on the outside as your wide receiver two. He's a guy, when you watch him on film, he's able to make some big plays, has a bunch of touchdowns at least, has had a couple of key problems being on the field. His health has not been the most steady. And I think his speed also not being where it is tells you there's probably a limit to what he can be. He's probably going to be a guy who, if he's going to get separation, he'll get it from routes now. The Senior Bowl, he showed up, was able to find separation at the line. A lot of ways I think Cardinals fans like to look at him as Anquan Bolden. I think that the idea of a Pierre Garçon or even a Braylon Edwards makes a lot more sense, because he's not a guy I think that you're going to talk about as being a future one. And when it comes to Cardinal standards, we have a high standard for those types of receivers here. He's the only receiver right now, I think, who's under contract through 2025 because of the Cardinals draft class. And I think that as far as for a rookie impact, it's really going to depend on how the Hopkins situation breaks down, as well as the quarterback situation. Because you could take a look at Arizona and say they're going to be running more 12 personnel this year. They're going to be running the football more. They're probably not going to lock guys into their current spots like they did under Cliff Kingsbury. You're going to be seeing a lot more diversity. And as a result, you may end up seeing the team and their smaller receivers maybe get a little bit less play as a result. You may see a Hollywood Brown on one side, DeAndre Hopkins on the other in this lot. And then who would you want to be your flanker receiver in that situation? Some people will say maybe it's a Greg Dortch. Some people say otherwise. You're probably going to use the talent while you have it there, because if you had to say, would you pick a Greg Dortch out of the slot or Hollywood Brown? I love Greg Dortch. Not necessarily a tough decision to make there. If the new scheme is what I think it will, you could see Michael Wilson getting snaps as that flanker on the outside. Now, one of the things, at least also as an issue for him, is his hands. His hand size is large, but as far as going into the red zone, one of the things you notice on tape was got touchdowns, but never really seemed to dominate in the red zone like you would hope a wide receiver of his size and height was. Even with those hops, I mean, he has a high enough vertical jump. You would expect him to be a big red zone threat. His hands also, there were times that he dropped balls, part of why he fell to the third round. This was ultimately a bad wide receiver class. The Cardinals, however, did need to add a wide receiver, in part because with Steve Keim, they trusted everything up to A.J. Green to be able to deliver. They invested draft capital in Hollywood Brown to add a second threat, and then didn't really use him after game one as a deep threat, which I think is fascinating because you see some of the deep passes to Hollywood Brown, some of the connections, whether it was health, deep ball not being there, offensive line play, combination of it all. Arizona really has a nice wide receiver room where you've got deep speed, close speed, and you can even talk about a guy who's got strength to be able to push through guys in a Michael Wilson. The Cardinals should have a decent receiver core next year, you would think. The biggest factor that's come up for all that would be health. Hopkins obviously missed the end of the season. Wilson has missed time. Rondale Moore has missed time. Hollywood Brown even last year missed time. When it comes to wide receivers, we got spoiled with the Larry Fitzgerald. This is how it probably will normally be for Cardinals fans, is you're going to have some guys who are going to deliver, some guys who ultimately will be a third-round pick and maybe fine. Maybe they top out at 500 to 800 yards in a season sometime during their rookie contract. Sometimes they don't hit it all. This was a pick that I liked, especially because you're getting a guy who doesn't have what I call the speed tax, where you're running the 4.3s, the 4.2s, going first round, going high second round. We've seen that as Cardinals fans with the Andy Isabella tax. It's not a good tax, not a good tax to pay. So that's with the receiver position for the most part with Arizona. Here's a couple of things I think that will happen with the Cards. So I think that at some point during this year, if I had to make one of the bold prediction for state of the Cards, you got to feel like DeAndre Hopkins will probably get dealt at some point. He's under contract for 2 more years. He's going to want to hit the free agency. There's 3 things I think could happen. The first one is he gets traded before or during the season. Monty Ossenfort, from what we know, hasn't come down from his price of a second-round pick. And when you think about guys like a Mohamed Sanu, other players who've gotten traded for a second-round pick at the trade deadline, makes a lot of sense to get a pick for the 2024 draft. Hollywood Brown, you want to see how he'll be able to bounce back. The problem with him is his contract specifically seems to indicate that he might be tied with Kyler Murray moving forward, but there's a lot of reason to not bring him back, especially due to when you look at how much other receivers are making at the position. When you look at, and this is just taking a look at some place like Over the Cap, you don't have to use Over the Cap, you can use your own. You want to look at contracts and being able to understand exactly how those contracts work out in the league. When it comes to wide receivers, most players are looking for that new guaranteed money. You can see how it's going to range up and down for the most part. You can see, at least with ultimately, the total value of some of the contracts that have been signed here with some of the top guys in the league is looking at probably about a range of 23 to about 17 million a year. Now, you got some guys who are in the last years of their deals, like Mike Evans, other players who are older who are a bit under that. But as far as the top receivers in the game, the Tyreek Hills, even the DeAndre Hopkins, the Cooper Kupps, they're up here north of $42 million guaranteed, but their average per year north of $25 million. So if you're going to be talking about a guy getting paid who's a Hollywood Brown, let's say he goes out, puts up a 1,000-yard season, you're hoping that that's one of the guys moving forward. At minimum, you're probably starting at $18 million a year. Now, is Hollywood Brown worth that? The answer is probably, depending on if you see that first half of Hollywood Brown, but in the end of it, does it fit Arizona's schedule? Is he a number 1 receiver? Is he a guy that you feel like is able to carry a lot of the offense outside of Cliff Kingsbury's offense? We'll have to wait and see on that. The biggest thing, of course, is when it comes to it, you see the Cardinals draft picks and how they've now got 2 firsts for next year. unless they trade any of those picks, you're probably going to be looking at, most likely, taking a receiver with an early pick, whether that's going to be in the first round, the second round, whether things change and you're re-signing Hollywood Brown, whether you like Michael Wilson, you like Rondale Moore and Greg Dortch. There's the possibility of the Cardinals moving on from DeAndre Hopkins, having some of those cap savings, and then being able to go a bit cheaper maybe at the position while relying on the draft or controlled contract. Part of that I can show at least here is going to be with, if you look at some of the other receivers, what they're making as rookies, what percent of their deal is guaranteed. You can look at some of these first round guys who are still on their opening deals, like a Justin Jefferson. This is what these guys who are making these first round draft picks are making. It's going to be about $13 million or so guaranteed, but about $3 million a year. So that brings up the question: would you put yourself in Monty Austin Ford's shoes? Do you pay 6 times the amount of drafting a first round receiver for Hollywood Brown? To me, it feels like that while there is an opportunity cost, receiver seems to be a position where Arizona overinvested and invested in the short term. They're kind of paying for some of that now. I think that what we can expect for this year would be Zach Pascal starting with some parts with Michael Wilson. I don't think you'll see a lot of Auden Tate. What you'll probably end up seeing is the team trying to use Rondale Moore in a different amount of roles, but it would not shock me if he and Greg Dortch are pushing each other for some time and ultimately fall behind of Marquise Brown and DeAndre Hopkins having to be in the slot, because if you're going to be putting Hopkins into the slot, you know that Brown can play outside. Neither of these receivers, at least, has demonstrated that ability. That's where I think it comes up. As far as it's concerned, moving on to the tackle side, mentioned earlier, Dennis Daly is one of the tackles they picked up. They also picked up Julian Davenport. DJ Humphries. Talked a little bit about how his salary cap and his cap hit. If you take a look at him, he's still under contract for 2025. However, you save about $16 million if he is released before then. And even next year, there is an out in his deal where you can either cut him, perhaps you'd look at restructuring, but more likely you would be able to save about $9 million, take on a $13 million cap hit. It really feels like at this point that the Cardinals would be looking at that sort of move, because they just drafted a left tackle who can play this year in Paris Johnson Jr. Now, our lads has him listed at left guard. They have Dennis Daly listed at left guard. I think that that will not be the case. If you're looking for where they're going to be playing, I could see Dennis Daly playing at that left or right guard spot. Now, Tennessee Titans fans despised him at left tackle last year. I don't think that's something Cardinals fans need to worry as much about. One of the things that I think will be interesting will be, does DJ Humphries get into training camp healthy where he's playing left tackle, as well as the relationship on the right side with Kelvin Beachum. Beachum actually signed a 2-year deal with the Cardinals. Essentially, it puts Josh Jones, for his any type of extension, he would get into doubt. As a result, because when you talk about, you've got a left tackle in Humphries, a left tackle in Beachum, a left tackle in Josh Jones. Beachum obviously has played right tackle, but he played left tackle for years before. And then you draft another one. That tells me that DJ Humphries' health isn't the same that we think, and that this is probably going to be a foundational piece. This would be like Monty Austin Ford looks at the house, and he could just say, yeah, we're good at tackle, bulldoze down the rest of the house. No. He went and broke up the foundation and is putting Paris Johnson Jr. there in the center. Love the move to get him. Cardinals obviously took him number 3 overall. As far as the rest of the team, the biggest question that most fans have had has not necessarily been at any of these starting positions. The biggest question has been at center. Now, we know that John Gaines, who's wearing number 59, is possible to be a center. We know that they like Lucida Smith, who got, I believe, 1 start last year against Aaron Donald. They signed Hjalte Froholt out of Cleveland. When you look at the structure of the team, there's 2 possibilities that I think we could see. The first possibility, to me at least, is more of you have a Froholt, Smith, Gaines type of competition. Maybe you have Froholt as a guy who's reliable starts the year. Maybe you do say, hey, we can put John Gaines, a much bigger, much more athletic upgrade. I'll talk about that in a second with him. And then the second option would be you do put Gaines at center, knowing that he may not be your center in 2024, But if your goal is to say, hey, we want to have our best O-line on the field, and you have versatile players, Paris Johnson Jr. can play left tackle, can play right guard, can play right tackle. Will Hernandez, left guard, right guard. Kelvin Beacham's played left tackle, right tackle. We've seen DJ Humphries in the past do it. You've seen Josh Jones be better at left tackle. And then another guy in John Gaines who can play multiple spots on the interior offensive line. One of my favorite picks the Cardinals did make this year. It lets me know that they probably are not sold on all of those guys who are veterans or starters being there for the whole year, or at least even working into 2024 plans. Outside of Paris Johnson and John Gaines, I think that you could see Kelvin Beachum moved on from. You could see the Cardinals even have Will Hernandez back up. You could see DJ Humphries. He'll probably start, but if he's not healthy for camp, then we've seen multiple years. DJ hasn't played in a whole lot of games. He finally got healthy for that one stretch in 2020. And since then, it's given enough reason to understand a little bit of why Paris Johnson was drafted to the Cards. As far as the center position, I think if I had to guess, I would say that their starting center is either A, on the roster in John Gaines, and that'll be that going forward, or B, it'll be on the roster next year. There was a lot of talk about Luke Whippler. Ultimately, Arizona passed on him, as many other teams did. And as far as the reason why, a lot of it seems to be similar to the Mason Cole issue. When Mason Cole was drafted by the Cardinals, he was a versatile lineman, had played left tackle, played center. You could argue you could put him at guard. That brings value. The issue with him was his athleticism was capped at a certain point. And when you talk about a Luke Whippler, his athleticism is capped probably even lower, and he only had experience at center. He left and declared early, a 20-year-old center. There's probably some strength he could put on. But at the end of the day, I feel like that the Cardinals would want, with Monty and with Jonathan Gannon, with the whole staff, a more athletic center, especially considering where they came from. They came from a place that had Ben Jones as a road grading center. They came from a team with Philly that had Jason Kelsey as their center. Those guys at least are overall higher caliber centers. And I think if the Cardinals could have gotten one of those guys in the draft this year, they would have. Where if they traded around, they did not. I don't have an issue with it, but I do think that if you're looking at Froholt, Smith, or Gaines at center, we've seen already how Kyler Murray has played with a great center and without. I would say that it'd be hard to be able to say the Cardinals can win for this season, or at least be able to make a long playoff push without finding a steady center like that in the middle of the field. Now, the last thing, at least overall, with offensive line predictions is I'll assume that DJ Humphries will start the season. We will see how that will go. I would think that Dennis Daly would go at left guard. I think that you do see Froholt start at center unless John Gaines is kind of the plan, is able to beat him out. Will Hernandez here. And then I could actually see Paris Johnson at least either at right guard, or I think he could be the starter at right tackle. We saw last year how Kelvin Beachum really had just shown that he was having a harder time with speed rushers off the edge. He wasn't having the same level of strength. I think that may be your opening starting lineup, and the left guard and center positions are the spots that maybe need the most amount of improvement. We'll see how Gaines is able to come in for that, because there is a lot to like about him. Let's talk about with the tackles in the offensive line before we move on to the next part of the draft. So with Paris Johnson, the nicest thing I think you can say about Paris Johnson is that he was maybe not my offensive tackle one in this class, but as far as it comes down to being a high-level left tackle, that's where he came through with. You can look at guys who previously have had similar measurables, DeBrickashaw Ferguson, Jawan Taylor. Obviously, he didn't actually go through and run the 40, but each of the different areas about him you can see, as far as with the explosiveness, being able to have the good size, the long arms to be able to stave off pass rushers. That's something that I don't think people like to talk about as much. Maybe it's a little bit overemphasized just because there's guys like Joe Thomas who have shorter arms who using technique can make it work. I wanted to at least show a little bit of what I found when I compared him to the likes of a DJ Humphries, and it was fascinating because Humphries, for his size, height, and his weight, he's smaller than we think. He has shorter arms than we think. The biggest thing he does have ultimately is he's got some quick range of motion, and he's got some explosiveness and punch to him. When you look at a DJ Humphries and say, all right, 307, talk a little bit about like where he lined up for the most part with how his strength was. And then you look at a Paris Johnson who ultimately is a player who I think fits much more of that left tackle mold. It becomes very clear to me that Humphreys had a good year, and since that point, we've seen issues with health. We've seen issues. He's a starting left tackle in the league, one of the top 32 tackles in the league. Left side, maybe you could even say top 50 tackle. The problem with DJ Humphreys, ultimately, I think here is not just his age, but the factor that Arizona, when you're going through this much of a reset or a rebuild, if you're confident that he's going to be there, he's going to be healthy, then you would be seeing the Cardinals extend him, in my opinion. I think that it's very clear that they go for a lot more athleticism and upside, more than even Steve Keim liked to, and from a big school, which is great news. One of the things I think we can also talk about here, at least, is with John Gaines, who is the offensive lineman who came out of UCLA, and wanted to bring up at least a interesting comparison, at least from our friend Josh Norris, who is part of Underdog Fantasy. He's done a great job of predicting the draft each year. Always recommend that you check out his stuff. He's got an interesting stat, at least overall, about his players that says, and I'll see if I can bring this up for you here on the screen. When you see guys who essentially have these type of measurables, when you're talking about the 3-cone drill, the 40-yard split, the 20-yard shuttle, you talk about this. Any type of a short shuttle that you see from a guy who's a 4.47 or better usually turns into a heck of a player at the National Football League level or is drafted pretty high. You can see longtime left tackles like Nate Solder. You can see an Eric Fisher, a longtime tackle like a Jake Matthews, even guys throughout round 2 and round 3. You can see some of these later round guys like a Zach Tom in 4th round starting for the Packers. You've got a Jason Kelsey in round 6 with a blazing 4.14 shuttle time. Part of what we see, at least from players like this, is that when you talk about having a 300-pound man who can move that quickly, it tells you a lot about their overall athleticism. And so this is something that I've felt excited about because when you see who is on the actual list of players there, one of those guys is the one the Cardinals drafted. At the 4.45 short shuttle, he is added to this list. So you're talking about, could you get an Ali Marpet, the James Daniels type of player here? I think the answer is yeah. James Daniels is a guy that was drafted by the Patriots, I believe, when Monty Austinfort was a general manager there. You can even see at least how some of these players have grown on to have, if not solid careers, at least they've been able to be starters. So I think that's one of the areas where, to me, what this says is that the analytics department in the Arizona Cardinals network has probably gotten a few more coaches who are tapped into it, a few more people who've been added to the personnel department. There's a lot, I think, to look forward to if you're a Cardinals fan who feels like the team has been stuck in the past that's making its way to the future. And I think a lot of that is the culture change that started with bringing a guy like Monty Austinfort in, bringing in a NFL quality head coach that other teams interviewed or were looking to hire. And that's where those 2 first picks being on the offensive line of having some of those thresholds and measurables was very exciting. It's not necessarily exciting for this year, but I think in the long term, you look at a team that has had dominant offensive lines like the Eagles, Patriots, even the San Francisco 49ers. The Cardinals are having to build around a new type of mentality and a new type of mindset. And these picks, I think, were a huge part of that. Now, moving on, at least here at the tight ends, this is one of the spots that I think the Cardinals are probably going to have to find help. Because from what we know about Arizona, from what everything that their offensive coordinator, Drew Petzing, has told us, they want to be more of a run-the-ball, 2 tight end, 12 personnel offense, closer to maybe what you'd see from the Rams, the 49ers, and it kind of all functions from the Kevin Stefanski tree, where it's this idea of being able to utilize a strong running game to pick up yards on the ground, using play action off of that running game to then be able to get guys open for not just quick completions, but for big plays down the field. Arizona's got Zach Ertz still extended for another 2 years under contract after last year where he got his extension. He's 33 years old, coming off an ACL. We're not quite sure about the time that he'll be back. We know that his ACL happened before Kyler Murray's, but we're not sure when he'll be back, which means Trey McBride is one of those guys who all of a sudden becomes a huge part of this team. They still need more. They've signed a couple of free agents. They still have had some issues, at least. There's probably going to be at some point another tight end who's a veteran the Cardinals may be able to bring in late, I would expect, goes into training camp and is able to be in that position. But really, a lot of their hopes and dreams are probably going to rely on Trey McBride in this year, and then I think next year with a 2024 pick. Moving on down now to the quarterback position. This was interesting. Cardinals drafted a day 3 quarterback. We talked about this earlier on the old ROTV pod, but the Cardinals needed a quarterback at that level. When you talk about having backup quarterbacks in the league, you got solid backup quarterbacks, but if you don't have a developmental quarterback waiting in the wings, you're going to end up in a situation probably less like the 49ers going to their 7th round pick and more like what we saw at the Cardinals last year. Kyler Murray goes out with injury. Obviously, can't predict that for everything. Usually starters will miss a game or two. Colt McCoy, when he misses a game, you end up seeing that teams who drafted that third day kind of guy, you get better access to having a guy with a stronger arm, more mobility, and a guy who also was able to be already in your system who knows it. But the Cardinals went to Trace McSorley. You can tell he didn't have the athleticism or the arm strength that was needed. They were able to take on guys in preseason, but against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we really saw how faulty the premise of the Cardinals was in that they could just go cheap at a quarterback. They moved on to David Blau, and ultimately I think that with Clayton Tune, you're talking about a quarterback who, regardless of whether or not the Cards will be rolling with Kyler Murray next year, you've got a backup who's similar enough in athleticism to be able to run this scheme. You talk about some of the guys who've come out. You see a Luke McCown, you see a Geno Smith, and even a Marcus Mariota, all of these types of players, at least. Tune is not a big guy. He's not the fastest guy. But he is ultimately still, compared to quarterbacks, much more athletic. So you can see, at least just based off of what we're seeing from Arizona, it's already very different from the approach that was taken before. They're talking about more explosive athletes. This is a guy who, if you're running him on a bootleg, he's not just a threat to run, but he can also pass well off of that run. He had over 10,000 passing yards when he was at Houston. I think it was about 11,996, almost 12,000 yards, 41 interceptions, but 104 touchdowns. Out of all the quarterbacks the Cardinals could have drafted on day 3, there were 2 of them that I liked. One of them was Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who is a faster, more speedy, but also maybe more chaotic type of a backup quarterback at this next level. And then there was Tune, who I felt like had the more level ceiling. He was probably, if the Cardinals were going to draft a quarterback on day 3, he would have been my guy. And I think going into next year with Colt McCoy's contract up, you're probably going to be talking about him being the backup quarterback for whatever starter is in place. You can see now the Cardinals laying the foundation out. They've got a foundation now of a left tackle of the future. They've got a quarterback who's going to be a long-term backup, having a wide receiver like an X or a Z guy on the outside who's there for a long time. They kind of went and hit a lot of the different areas of the needs for the draft, but in ways it wasn't necessarily the 2023 impact play now type of picks versus, I think, play into the future. As far as it also goes with quarterbacks, they did sign Jeff Driscoll out of Houston. It seems like that this is one of the places where he was signed before the draft. You're talking about Colt McCoy not necessarily being healthy to start training camp, potentially still coming off of some of the injuries he suffered late last year. It feels like that Driscoll is probably a guy who's going to be around for the camp versus being a camp arm, and he and David Blau, I would expect, will compete with each other. It's possible they could beat out Tune, but considering the fact that Blau not under contract for next year, Driscoll not under contract for next year, Colt McCoy not under contract for next year, I feel pretty solid that Clayton Tune, as long as he doesn't look abysmal in camp, is probably going to be the guy who you're going to tell at least will get one of those backup jobs. Colt McCoy, depending on health, how that's structured, at least would be the favorite to get the other. And then you'll have Blau and Driscoll, essentially. One of those two will probably make it to and through camp, one will not. And finally, running back. Running back was one of the positions I felt the Cardinals probably could take earlier than many thought this year. They were connected to several running backs throughout the process. Tank Bigsby was a big one. He went to the Jaguars. But what we saw last year from Keontae Ingram tells you probably have a third running back here. And if you talked about the Cardinals and said they still had Eno Benjamin on their roster, this may have been a bit better of a room. Obviously, they had a falling out with with the current staff. Things did not turn out the way that anyone I think had wanted. Much less Benjamin. We see that James Conner, who's missed time with health issues, not just this year, but in previous years, is back. But because of that and because of the Cardinals, I think that one of the things you can expect from the running game this year is they're not going to have nearly as many rushes as I think they have in years past. The Cardinals last year were trailing all the time, which meant that they had the 6th most pass attempts in the NFL. This year, they're going into it with a defense that does not have J.J. Watt. And that is a place where you're also saying they're missing Byron Murphy, they're missing Zach Allen, 2 of the guys who made a huge impact for them on the team. That tells me that they're probably not going to be as good on defense as they were even last year. And that's one of the weird things of saying that you can probably expect the Cardinals may have to throw the ball even more, whether it's catching up, whether it's getting behind. And so I wouldn't think that James Conner and Keontae Ingram, even though the Cardinals are going to be attempting a lot more rushes this year, there's a possibility that defense may cap their running game. And so as a result, I don't know if you can say that the likes of a James Conner or a Keontae Ingram is going to perform this year. I feel like this is another place, at least, where you can talk about with this 2024 type of draft where the Arizona is going to be probably looking at the future for taking a pick on a running back even as high as round 2. It's hard to see round 1 because of gaping needs that they have and how they seem to be drafting positional value. We've already seen it this year. We've seen left tackle. We've seen wide receiver. We've seen cornerback taken in the first few picks. We've seen edge rusher. Previously, we saw the Cardinals spend picks on linebackers, spend first-round picks on quarterback year over year. We've seen offensive line picks on a guy who sat for a year in DJ Humphries. I think that it's easy to be able to look at Arizona and say that the running game is probably going to be with James Conner entering in. I believe he's got at least 1 more year on his deal technically after this. We're going to be probably talking at least about how the Cardinals next year are going to need a dynamic running back to be able to run the system, to run the scheme. And it's going to be very interesting for the Cardinals. Now, we've got James Conner as far as with his contract structure, it looks like at least is not on here. Let me go back to our good old friend with the salary cap. Yeah, James Conner, at least for that one here with 2024, is under contract for next season. Not 2025. So he's got this year, next year left on his deal. I think that you probably hold on to him, start him. The biggest thing with Keontae Ingram, at least, is, and this is the area I think that you have to recognize, is he is not nearly as, make sure I get this one right. He's not nearly, I think, as explosive or athletic as you would think as far as his size. Like, he's a 6-foot kind of guy, 221 pounds. But he does have enough explosiveness. He showed hands in the passing game where if you're talking about a guy who has to kind of carry the load this year coming off of that, I think he's one of those guys who can do that. He's not obviously going to be comparing to some of these guys like a Larry Johnson, at least former Cardinal, who went left to a different team, different time. But Bernard Pierce, a guy who was always either the running back 2 next to Ray Rice, a guy who, Ray Rice. Anyway, a guy who was able to take on RB1 duties if need be. I think that's what you're able to get here. That's something that can perform well there with the halfback. He also, as far as a running back, doesn't have a lot of guys who've had that same success in the league outside of one being Joe Mixon. Mixon even himself was just a much more dynamic athlete for his size. I think at least when you're talking about the Cardinals and their running back situation, kind of falls into the play of that's something that you're going to be talking about, I think, in 2024 is finding a new starter, but it's suitable for this year. Moving on to the defensive side, and I got a mess. Just straightforward. Got a pretty messy mess. With Zach Allen and Byron Murphy leaving in free agency, you push either a 1-year LJ Collier or Jonathan Ledbetter to start at defensive end. Thus, you're probably going to be taking one of your draft picks last year in Cameron Thomas and either playing him at defensive end position, or you're going to be looking at a lot of issues with the front 3 players, because last year the Cardinals, as far as it came to with their pass rush, they were not good. As far as in 2023, the amount of sacks that they gave up was one of the higher ones, but part of that was built around the fact that Defense was not good. They were not getting pressures. And as a result of that, the team last year, at least, if I believe correctly, was let me make sure I get this correct here. As far as for sacks per game, the Cardinals were actually in the middle of the pack, just under 1 sack per game. That was with J.J. Watt. J.J. Watt being removed from the team, you're probably going to be looking at the Cardinals taking another hit on their pass rush. I think you could see their sack leader this year potentially even be a B.J. Ojulari or a Cameron Thomas, depending on how they line up. We'll likely see Arizona move to more of a 4-3, which is where I think you'll see Cameron Thomas be one of these defensive ends. And they'll be able to have B.J. Ojulari, LJ Collier, and the likes of a Myjai Sanders rotating in at that pass rushing linebacker spot. In the offseason, the Cardinals did upgrade their right linebacker with Kaiser White to play kind of the Kaiser White role. This is a role that a lot of people had looked at Isaiah Simmons for, kind of that Kaiser White type of role. Well, they go out and get Kaiser White. They also have a guy in Owen Popo who is essentially ranked after him, and he's got one of the most interesting player profiles of it. You take a look at a guy like a Quan Alexander with shorter arms, shorter height, but who has some explosiveness of his 40 and his vertical jump. And you take a look at Owen Popo, and you see that there is a lot similar. Quicker on the split, good vertical jumps, smaller type of a player. He really does end up comping pretty well to the likes of a Quan Alexander if you can see that guy in those later rounds. Now, Quan Alexander also was drafted in a totally different round. He was taken, I remember correctly, in the 4th round. Yep, 4th round, whereas Popo was in the 6th. I think you're going to be talking at least about the Cardinals not spending big picks on a linebacker, but being able to get in high athleticism. Now, obviously, what differs this guy from the likes of someone who's a Isaiah Simmons? And the answer, of course, is that height, weight, speed combo. Isaiah Simmons ultimately with measuring in at 93 percentile height because he's a 6'4" guy, having long arms, and then also with how explosive his 40, broad jump, and vertical was. You can clearly see, you got your no broad jump. You got your broad jump, vertical, and 40 are all close. But the biggest difference being Simmons is just a lot taller and a lot faster, giving him a little bit more of that upside. I think that this is a guy that you sit for a year, you play special teams, you bring him into another role next year. He may actually even be that rare 6th round starter, depending on how they use Simmons this year. Again, without picking up that 6th-year option, perhaps it's a spot where you see a team look to trade for him during the season. I think it's more likely after the season. His team signed. There's been some mention about him in the Hassan Reddick role as a pass rusher. I think that what we'll see from the other linebacker with the Arizona Cardinals, which I know they list it as Zaven Collins, they've been lining him up with the edge rushers. I think that tells me that they're probably going to be doing a new type of defense where Kaiser White's in the middle, Zaven Collins will be in one of the sides. Perhaps it's a pass rushing side. And it might be that they keep Isaiah Simmons in the cornerback room as a nickel, like how he was used last year as a nickel safety. That may be more of the fit that they find. Whatever he does, though, we're probably going to project to Popo, knowing that that's going to be the case for the next year. We'll see if Kyle Soell is able to stick onto the roster for Arizona. End of the day, it's hard to say if there's not too much to talk about, but really when you're talking about impact players, you see the Cardinals were a team that had Chandler Jones. They were a team that had signed J.J. Watt the last 2 years. They had these 2 impact players. And now you're hoping that one of the draft picks can hit in a huge way, because outside of that, it looks pretty bleak. With your cornerback right now, you have Antonio Hamilton and Marco Wilson. Neither of them are cornerback 1. You're talking about either of these guys going up against a Cooper Kupp, going up against another team with the wide receiver 1. A team like a Garrett Wilson with the Jets, I don't believe they played them this year, but you're talking at least about not quite having that cornerback 1. Last year, Byron Murphy played that cornerback 1 role, but his back gave up on him. You did not bring him back if you're a Cardinals fan. You didn't bring back Patrick Peterson. You're kind of starting from scratch, which is why I liked the Garrett Williams pick, I should say. Williams is interesting because he's a guy who's slightly undersized, and Williams, there we go. He reminds me a little bit of a Greg Toller type. Now, Greg Toller was maybe a little bit taller. You can at least see here with how he measures up. Height, small. Weight, small. Arm length, small. Hand size, small. He was injured, did not really practice workout. He was expected to run kind of in that 4.4, 4.5 range, so not necessarily a 4.3 type of athlete. But he also measured at 5'10", 192. You're hoping that he's one of those guys that you're talking about that is able to come in, be able to kind of be that cornerback too, or be able to at least come in and be able to man the slot to the point where you're able to play a two safety type of system. Something that the Cardinals have really struggled with ultimately has been some of their best playmakers, and Jalen Thompson and Budda Baker have both been probably strong safeties, which is the guy who is in the run game, is making plays, is coming up to tackle. The free safety being the guy who moves their coverage either side of the field. You can mix up those guys, which Arizona's been able to do. But you have to be able to have someone who's able to then also be able to step in and rush the passer, be in the slot. Budda Baker being a jack of all trades has really helped them be able to be secured for the most part in the run game and on the back end in coverage as well for some of these deep passing plays. Without Budda, you're probably going to be looking at another huge retool unless you're able to move Simmons to a safety role, and I don't think that's his long-term best fit. He seems like he's been more of a tweener where you could play him at safety, but you're going to have, limitations there. The last thing I'll say about Garrett Williams ultimately is people had a really interesting response that wasn't talked about enough, which is where when Monty Williams said, hey, Garrett Williams, one of those guys at least, they said, would he have gone higher in the draft if not for his injury? And he didn't say yes. He said, yeah, he may have not, and talked about how there's a lot of talented players, a lot at the position. You wonder if this was a coach pick, was this a Monty pick? How much of this is a spot where he was just being honest with the defensive back? And I think that there's a good example or a good chance that he's just a little bit smaller than what it seems like the Cardinals profile for. It seems like that they did want to get another cornerback into the room. They just don't have a lot on the staff right now. I feel like that he would have liked a different type of cornerback. And as a result, we're probably going to see what's most interesting is a guy who I like the Cardinals to be able to draft, and Ketrell Clark. If I can find it, his name here. Ketrell Clark. Hold up here. Let's get that name spelled right. Ketrell, that's right, with an I. Ketrell Clark. This is a guy that I thought the Cardinals were going to take earlier as than what they did because he has a much faster time, fits more of that profile of being able to be that smaller nickel corner. Doesn't have the size, the height, the weight. He's only 5'10", 180 pounds. A lot of receivers these days are smaller, which is helpful. He was one of the guys that I thought they could draft in round 4. Maybe if they moved back with the pick, picked up an extra 5th-round pick, which is essentially what they did. He's one of the players that I think will be a special teamer in year 1. And then depending on what happens with their corners and their other situation, maybe you talk about him in year 2 as being one of those nickel guys. That could be a spot where maybe you've got matchups with Garrett Williams being able to go on inside or outside, Clark coming on or off the field, depending on the packages that they have. But ultimately, when you're looking at the cornerback room, this reminds me a lot of the 2019 Cardinals depth chart, unfortunately. And that was, of course, you remember the depth chart that required and needed Patrick Peterson. And when you look at their team back in the May of that year, just coming off the NFL draft, they were in better shape. You had Robert Alford, who obviously we know didn't ever really play for the Cardinals. You have Patrick Peterson on one side, Byron Murphy being able to kind of be a rookie who got torched quite a bit behind him, but was able to pick it up by the end of the season. And then, of course, you have the leftover Brandon Williams and Chris Jones. This was not a good depth chart. Murphy was probably the best defensive cornerback that they had on the team, as Ralford's injury essentially and just did not play. That still was a better depth chart, honestly, than what we're seeing from the Cardinals this year. And that tells me that it's probably going to be really difficult with the front line and a cornerback room like that. Unless you're able to see the scheme really develop, I would say the Cardinals could have one of the worst defenses in the NFL. And it's not to get down on or be mopey. It's kind of how it is. You want to see them step up. But when you're comparing across the board to other previous teams, other spots, like last year, they had a decent room with Byron Murphy kind of stepping up and being that number 1 cornerback. And what happened after he got hurt? Well, then we saw things kind of tumble down, and it really has only added some rookies to the mix who aren't even necessarily a rookie of the talent caliber of Byron Murphy Jr. So, like, in reviewing each of these different places, the last one, of course, is the safety. Buda Baker obviously asks for a trade. From what I heard, the trade was at least multiple first-round picks to start, was what it was reported or rumored. There was a thought that maybe money could come down if it was, say, a first-round pick this year, a second next year. There's been questions, but ultimately, I think that they don't want to let go of Buda Baker because, as I said, he's been a core piece. He wants to be part of the team. I think that Buda has been on the team and having to step up into a leadership role that he may not necessarily have wanted to do. We saw him be a star on the Hard Knocks the last year, but he's a safety. Like, it's not like he's the J.J. Watt guy who's going to basically yell and encourage a lot of the other people who's been in the league for, almost a decade at a Hall of Fame type of level. He's a more quieter guy. He's not that guy who's even on the offensive side who's going to talk about how dynamic at least the play is going to be, who's going to be leading the team, who's going to make those plays either. It feels a lot like I think the Cardinals are in a place where you'd want to see Buda Baker and you want to see DeAndre Hopkins play for them this year, but the impact maybe on the field is lessened somewhat unless Kyler Murray is healthy to start week one. And it'd be more about the other younger players behind stepping up. And the unfortunate nature of J.J. Watt is we saw him pour into a Zach Allen, see Zach Allen leave. And so as a result, you kind of feel like that it was a nice finish for JJ's career, but it really didn't impact the Cardinals so much as JJ Watt impacted the Cardinals community, some of the other players. What you need to have as far as a winning organization is concerned is to have both. Impact on the field, impact off the field, impact on players below you. That's something I think is going to be missed this year, considering just what's happening with this team. And finally, of course, the specialist is the other thing that we can talk about, which is it's unique, at least with Arizona. So the special teams right now, as far as the Cardinals are concerned, they re-signed their kicker for the next 2 years. I think that they're going to get a new kicker drafted, maybe not next year. Right now, Matt Prater's the guy. They got Elliott Fry essentially challenging him. They really don't have, they've got Nolan Cooney's a punter, but on the punt team, they really haven't gotten a true punter back yet. Andy Lee is, of course, as old as Tom Brady is. We'll see if they move on or not. I know the Cardinals did sign Chris Boyd. He's more of the special teams type approach. Some of the other special teamers I think we'll see is Dennis Gardeck, Ezekiel Turner, Rashad Fenton, who we know that they brought in as a free agent last year. And, of course, Owen Papo is going to be another special teamer, I think, as well, as potentially B.J. Ojolari. We haven't been talking about Dante Stills yet. He's a high upside guy. I'll get to him in a second. But first, with special teams, this is a spot where I feel like the Cardinals could have moved on from Matt Prater, and the fact that they didn't tells me that they're probably not going to get anything better, and it's not one of those seasons where it felt like they wanted to go out and just try a new kicker out. We saw that happen in 2018 with the Cardinals. We saw that happen, I think it was before that, actually. We saw them in the 2020 draft, having Chandler Catanzaro have a down year. He missed quite a few. We saw, I think, with wasn't Catanzaro, Zane Gonzalez, that was the guy. Chandler Catanzaro, new guy, misses a bunch, new guy misses a bunch. They seem to be content with Prater moving forward, but with his age, I would think that they'd go for a different kicker in 2024 as well. So there's just a lot of needs if you look at the 2024 NFL draft. You're talking about defensive end help. You're talking about edge being a spot where you're questioning if you're settled or not at it. You're talking about the center position. You're talking about the running back position. And you're talking about the wide receiver position. Now you throw in a kicker, maybe even a punter into that mix. You're starting to kind of realize, okay, the Cardinals have a team that they can field. But as far as it comes to the Cardinals fielding a good team, you don't feel as confident in some of this. Now, I did want to talk at least about Dante Stills as we kind of wrap up our draft coverage in each of those. Stills was interesting because he was a guy who played at West Virginia, and he was a phenomenal guy of getting after quarterbacks from the interior this year. He did really, really well ultimately with that one. I think, if I remember correctly, I'm looking this up here real quick. Stills he's a little bit older at age 23, but not quite the oldest. He's a guy who ended up coming in about 286 pounds. You're talking about a guy who plays in the interior. It's a little bit light. He had some good measurables and ended up essentially, I believe it was in 2021. He stayed there an additional part of his life, at least for the most part, through the COVID year. Let me pull up his stats real quick because this is one is the one player I have not verified with all of that yet. Here we go. 4.5 sacks, 13 tackles for loss in 2022. Ended up being one of their actual All Big 12 players. You're talking about a guy who also is great character from what we've known too. He had the school record for career games played. He stayed here from all the way back in 2018, which doesn't seem like it's that long ago. Then you look at 2023, else that was 5 years ago. This is one of the players that I think, I don't know if I'll say starter, but rotational piece I could definitely see. Until he doesn't have any high-end comparables, at least, with like a Jonathan Babineau, Spencer Johnson. There's not really that many interior defensive line guys that are there. When you put him and take a look at him compared to just defensive line in general, there's a couple of guys, like I think there's a Darius Smith being a guy that he has some similarities to. The issue, and I think difference being Smith obviously has a much better height, weight, and height, weight, and as far as for core strength with the bench press, you can see how Zadarius Smith has at least that upper leverage. Stills has been more of a knifing through tackle for a loss player from the film that I've watched. I think that's one of the going to be the spots that you can find is the Cardinals could use a nose tackle, but if they can find that guy next year, then I think Adante Stills being a guy who can line up next to him could end up being solid. You talk about a long-term having whatever that nose guy looks like up front, having a Dante Stills on one side, a Cam Thomas on the other. Now, when you're in these packages, if you're rushing forward to BJ Ojolari or MIJ Sanders, you're starting to talk about a functional unit up front. Right now, though, as being rookies, some of the draft capital investment doesn't seem to hit the same way. So that's kind of just a recap, at least, of overall the draft. Let's talk about the biggest topic that everyone has been going over, which is the 2024 mock drafts. Now, the two early mock drafts always show some of the issues that we've seen in the past, like the 2022 early mock draft and the 2023 early mock draft will show just how right and how wrong some of these projections are. So let's take a look here at the way too early position. This is one of the funny areas you can see. Sometimes teams get it completely right, but this is what happened in 2022, coming off the 2021 draft. Cardinals trade for Hollywood Brown. Sam Howell, who went the 5th round next year, was the first quarterback. JT Daniels, who wasn't even the starter at Georgia this season. Stetson Bennett took over and was drafted in the 3rd round this year. Was quarterback 2. DeMarvin Leal, he was like, I don't even believe he was drafted, at least for the most part. And I don't believe that he was taken in the Steelers, at least for the most part, took him round 3. So this is a guy you're talking about, the top 3 pick, round 3. In the entire 2022 NFL draft, the one player that they really got right was Derek Stingley, and the second player that got right was Kayvon Thibodeau. There was also a couple of linemen that made it in there, but even with this, with Spencer Rattler, Drake Jackson with an edge, you only really have a lot of those early picks. A lot of times guys can get overhyped at a couple positions. One of those positions is quarterback. No one knew what Kenny Pickett was going to do going into the 2021 year. No one knew that Spencer Rattler was just going to get a job lost at Oklahoma and Caleb Williams would take over. The one thing that does happen, though, is that you can see how some of these teams, where they have a quarterback 1 or a quarterback 2 option, you end up seeing other times where the class ends up being stronger. So this, of course, was a year in which we saw a lot of struggles for teams as far as with not liking the quarterback class. You take a look here at what we saw from 2023, and you take a look at the fascinating aspect of how right people got a year ago. So they had Bryce Young as the number 1 pick, or CJ Stroud as the number 1 pick for almost all the mock drafts, and Alabama's Will Anderson going top 2 or going top 3. It was a stronger top-end class that we saw. And the early mocks, whatever you want to call them, they were right this year. Like, were they perfect? No. They had the Seattle Seahawks picking at 3 with their own draft picking with the Broncos and the Falcons. So you don't want to go with just everything that you have from guessing the teams. When you go Super Bowl odds, you can also sometimes be wrong. A lot of people thought that the Falcons were going to be an abysmal team. They ended up being competent overall through the ground. They've added more picks this year. A lot of people are projecting the Cardinals and Texans to pick at 1-2. History tells us there's probably going to be another team that falls all the way down there. And then this year, you can see it was not the Houston Texans. They ended up getting the number 2 pick. It was the Carolina Panthers were not there. It was the Chicago Bears were the team. The Detroit Lions went up. Chicago Bears went down. Brian Brzee, also first-round pick. Kayshon Boutte went in the 6th round, I believe, or maybe 5th round. All in all, it's not good to look at some of these mocks unless this is the case, you have what are blue chip, clear talents. And I call those the top 5 locks. So these are guys who would be a lock in the top 5 almost no matter what. And we had two of those this year for sure, maybe even a third with C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young, and Will Anderson. There was a lot of talk of Tyree Wilson going ahead of Will Anderson. End of the day, didn't happen. Some people, even with the Jackson Smith and Jigba, he went in the 1st round, but wasn't a top 5 lock. So when you're talking about a top 5 lock, you want it to be one of 2 things. One is usually an edge who has just been so dominant that you're saying, hey, this is definitely a guy who's going to be one of the top 5 picks next year. You think of a Nick Bosa type. He was a top 5 pick before he stepped on the field, got hurt, spent the last few games off of the field getting ready for the draft, still goes at number 2. When you look at this year with the earlier mock drafts, teams often are going with the top odds, essentially, with the Cardinals picking with their own pick, or maybe the Texans pick, Caleb Williams, quarterback at USC, the Heisman winner. He's listed at 6'1", about 210 or so. Obviously, this is one of the cases where if the Cardinals do pick this high, it almost becomes like Josh Rosen, Kyler Murray Part 2. A lot of Cardinals fans, myself included, like Kyler. There's also flaws that we can see with Kyler as far as going through, whether it's going through the different reads. He managed his system. There were a lot of quick, easy reads, a lot of guys not as much moving around. It helped and got him adapted to the league quickly, but within Cliff Kingsbury's scheme, the adjustments really didn't happen, and they had to shift to a different approach. Some of the approach was that Kyler over the middle looked a lot like Russell Wilson, not hitting guys over the middle, not hitting shallow over the middle, essentially not taking advantage of some of that. Caleb Williams has shown so far that he's been tall enough, at least at 6'1", to so far look over, but it's something to monitor. Second one, Marvin Harrison Jr., 1,200 yards this year, 6'4", 208 pounds, big receiver. He's probably about as close to a top 5 lock outside of maybe injury that you can get, because he's been ranked higher than guys who were picked at number 12, than a guy who was picked overall at number, I believe it was Jackson Smith and Jigba went at pick, it wasn't 15 this year. Smith and Jigba, he was selected by the Seahawks, pick 20. So obviously some of those guys you see are not quite top 10 players. Injury will be one of the things that knocks them down. So the Buccaneers are given the next worst odds. They've got Baker Mayfield. They did take a another quarterback this year, at least, to be probably a backup. But when you talk about some of the guys who are like Olu Fashanu, people like cornerback and Kool-Aid McKinstry, even a Jared Verse, some of these players that you're seeing in these mock drafts are not going to go that high. Some of them will. We've seen in the past, like an Emeka Egbuka is probably going to go that high. The 2 quarterbacks, whenever you got 2 quarterbacks who are listed as the top 2 guys across the board, if they live up to that status the following year, they're going to go 1-2. Like, that's what we've seen in the past years. We've seen Andrew Luck and Robert Griffin III. We've seen Jameis and Marcus Mariota. We've seen 1-2s go all the time. And that's where it leads into the question with the Arizona Cardinals, which is, if the Cardinals are going to be in the 2024 NFL draft, and they're going to kind of own the draft. And this is, again, before we're talking about anything else concerned. We haven't even played the games yet. The question then becomes, will they, should they, and can they? Because here's the thing. Just because you can tank or should tank can tank doesn't mean you should tank. And we can see already, as far as with the round selections, we haven't gotten everything finalized yet, but we're going to see how Arizona is going to be having essentially one of the best amounts of picks in 2024. They already have the Houston Texans first, which I think is a pick that very well could turn into Marvin Harrison Jr., which if you're telling me the Texans could have put C.J. Stroud and Marvin Harrison Jr. together, they still have the potential of adding another second-round pick from DeAndre Hopkins. So now if you imagine a second-round pick here, I don't know if they're going to trade or keep Budda Baker. My assumption is Budda is a Cardinal until otherwise noted. If he gets hurt next year, then maybe that last year of the deal looks different. But You're talking about being able to find a center, a running back, a receiver, defensive end, or an edge, maybe even a kicker with one of these late picks. This is what it's all about, that first round pick. Do you trust Kyler Murray? And this is where I think I agree with Seth Cox, at least for the most part, and said this earlier in one of the tweets I sent out today. Let me go ahead and get to my Twitter timeline. The Arizona Cardinals, I don't think have a choice but to move on from Kyler Murray next year. If they have a top 7 pick, they've got all these different draft picks. If you're picking top 10 in the draft, and Kyler, at least we've seen what he looks like. I don't think that I would say you don't even have to see what he looks like. You're talking about a guy you've paid $40 million a year to, whereas the contracts that you'd give for the top picks overall are going to be probably about $40 million total. Kyler Murray, when he came into the league, with his first deal, he was made a 4-year, $36 million deal. And there's a 5th-year option added onto that. You're talking about $10 million a year. You're talking about a contract in which a quarterback will have so much cap room that is created by being on the contract for 4 years at $40 million versus $40 million every year for 4 years. You need to have a star who's able to lift other people up on the team, who's able to have other players on the team where then you can build around them with draft picks. Now, normally you'd say the Cardinals would be in this spot ready to build around, but it's not like it's the Aaron Rodgers situation where they went like an 8-8 and needed to kind of retool a bit. You're seeing a lot of what unfortunately seems to be the case of their players wanting out or being jettisoned, which tells me that I think there's a much better chance of them ending up with one of these top picks than we think. Because at one point, they're going to have 1 to 2 rookies on the offensive line. You're going to have, at best, you're going to have your starting cornerbacks be Antonio Hamilton and Marco Wilson. You might also have 1 to 2 rookies there. You're going to have replacement level players on the defensive end, nose tackle and defensive tackle line. That means that your passing situation, run situation is off. Your offensive line isn't going to be as tight as you would hope it would be. Maybe that changes. Maybe the offensive line ends up being the strength. Your running back situation is going to basically rely on James Conner's health or be able to rely on Keontae Ingram kind of taking that step into being a solid guy. Your wide receiver situation is good for a year, but at the end of the day, even if Kyler Murray comes back, you could see a situation very similar to the Arizona Cardinals this past season. 2023 Cardinals were a team that was not good enough to be able to limit teams defensively. It was still the best part of the team. Their offense was abysmal. No deep pass, all sorts of struggles that they had as far as being able to move the ball in general, just downfield, with so many issues with their current game plans up front. Even if the Cardinals are able to do a little bit more next year, it feels like this is definitely a spot where the team is really going to be reliant on Kyler Murray stepping up, learning the offense, and doing well. And I think that a lot of people have questioned, is that something that Kyler Murray is able to do? And that's where I think we'll finish with today, at least, is I think Cardinals, you can look at how Monty Ossenfort, I think you can call it saying that there's an adult in the room now. Instead of investing draft picks into proven players because he couldn't hit on guys in the draft. And we'll see. No, this may be a colossal failure of a draft for Monty Ossenfort. But he at least had a plan of going back, getting more picks, and building around some of that cheap talent and still finding guys this year that could fill in for some of those roles, such as a Michael Wilson, such as a John Gaines, even a Clayton Tune. Being able to have that long-term approach, I think, has been solid. Kyler Murray, there's been questions at least about whether or not he is able to call protections, how much of that's up to the offensive line. And that was the issue I always had with Cliff's offense, was it felt like protections were not set well. Duke Manyweather, who's a guy who at least has worked with a lot of guys in the past, has left up some areas with Kyler Murray, and you kind of can start to build a little bit of some of the narrative, like Buda Baker has wanted out. You can look at Kyler Murray at least coming off of injury. He's in the building now, which is really great. I want to at least bring up this tweet, at least for the most part, about with questions about Kyler Murray. And he said that this is a guy who works with a lot of NFL teams, said about Kyler, said that he was not necessarily listening to the high level guys. So this is Duke Manyweather, at least said the guy who's connected, knows a lot of guys personally in the NFL. He said at least this, which kind of fits some of what we've seen. Kyler didn't listen to a future Hall of Fame center, that being Rodney Hudson, as it relates to protections. We saw that when they had protections in the week 1 game of 2021 against the Titans, there was a blitz call that came out. Rodney Hudson points, picks it out, passes it along. Kyler throws a hot route to Hopkins. Boom, touchdown. When Hudson wasn't on the field, we saw issues and struggles in the protections. Now, the question is, did Kyler set protections himself? Did the offensive line have more say in setting the protections? The fact that they said he didn't listen to the future Hall of Fame center, it has this narrative building of, all right, Kyler Murray comes in, he's questions at least about what the attitude is. People question with the interviews, comes into the league, plays well, wins Rookie of the Year. Gets this contract demand that's put out. You see his agent, I fault for a lot of the areas, at least just kind of drag stuff through. He gets kind of tossed under the bus, probably by a lot of Cardinals leakers. You get to the contract ability and being able to study. You get to the questions, at least ultimately. And I think that the biggest question around Kyler Murray that I would say is that if you're looking at him, he's going to have to learn a new playbook. He's going to have to be able to do new plays with guys he knows, guys that maybe he doesn't know. And he's going to be able to have to do all of this with learning a new playbook because he hasn't changed his playbook or being since high school. He's been running essentially that same type of air raid offense, the same type of read options, the same type of approach. He hasn't had the same long-winded types of, like 17-syllable play calls that Jared Goff did on the Rams or Matthew Stafford would call in the Sean McVay system. You're talking about him having to learn that whole playbook. He's got plenty of time because he's not really going to be able to do much outside of rehab. Coming back in at some point, whether it's week 1 or say it's in November, and he's going to have to execute that without necessarily having had a training camp to go through, because even if he comes back week 1, he won't have a training camp. And to me, that is such a huge uphill battle because what we've seen from Kyler before is when there were problems or issues, his athleticism would bail him out. They'd have set plays they'd be able to hit. They'd have other times he'd be able to essentially be a creative passer, would bail him out of different places with his legs. A lot of times he didn't throw on the run as much as I think we would have liked. I think a lot of people would think of, the Patrick Mahomes bails the pocket, throws backward across his body, hits a guy with that arm strength. A lot of people, I think, wanted to see some of that from Kyler Murray. And instead, Kyler would often take off, run for 20 yards or so, and then kind of be able to take it out there. And it feels like that the narrative is building where Kyler, essentially, if he's going to keep his job, he's going to have to not just win out as far as from the quarterback position and play well when he does come back, but he may need some help because if the Texans end up with the number 1 or number 2 pick, and you're the Cardinals saying, hey, Kyler played well, we can move off of him, get a brand new quarterback in here. The way of the NFL goes is that you're always replaceable if someone better comes along. And that's just the unfortunate nature. The best way to get an edge, as we saw, even with Steve Keim, who a lot of people can agree was not doing a great job as general manager, he was able to field a competitive team for a while, obviously, with Kyler Murray under contract on that rookie deal. I thought for sure that a couple of years ago that when you saw Sean McVay that they would see them let Jared Goff go to a different team, draft another quarterback, kind of run it back using that offensive line in the run game. Instead, we saw them double down on Matthew Stafford, get to a Super Bowl, and now they're kind of looking uphill with the Cardinals as well, although it really comes down to Aaron Donald, Matthew Stafford, and Cooper Kupp. And the Arizona side, it comes down to Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, and maybe Buddha. As far as if you're going to talk about impact player, I think the difference between one of the best defensive players in the NFL and Buddha, who may be the best safety in the NFL, or at least should be up there, it's definitely a big difference. The amount of time that Kyler is able to play is going to be very interesting because it feels like to me that the Cardinals may be in a spot where they move on regardless. They traded back with a team that's supposed to be bad. They were also looking to trade back almost no matter what, because if I was a general manager and I had the number 3 pick and I believed in Kyler Murray, I'm taking Will Anderson. I'm getting that elite top-notch pass rusher. I'm letting my quarterback be able to say, hey, we're going to go out and compete as best as we can. We're getting a guy who can start right away for you. We're going to be still building all the rest of the way. The fact that they traded back from that pick and were seemingly desperate to get back and get a 2024 pick feels like that's hedging their bet. Sure, they can maybe bet on Kyler Murray Maybe they don't have a choice because of what Steve Keim and Michael Bidwell did signing him. Maybe they do. We'll talk about Michael Bidwell and some of the other stuff with the Cardinals at a different time. But for now, it feels like a lot of the stuff when you're talking about whether it's smoke or fire, the fact there's so many people who are looking at this Cardinals roster and saying that they're the favorite to end up with the number 1 or number 2 pick. I feel like I can agree with that. I think that a lot of people are saying they won't end up with that. They'll be kind of coached into it. I think that the talent level on the team on the defensive side is going to be a limit for them. If you're taking a Will Anderson and taking maybe another defensive tackle, maybe you grab a tackle in the second round or something with Paris Johnson. You probably could sell me on them doing a little more to be that 6-10 type of team with some of the coaching. I think at the end of the day that there's just so much that they're overhauling that we'll see, at least for how high they can fly is a 6-win season, and you're picking maybe top 5 to top 10. But if you look at this Cardinals team and say, man, the 2022 Cardinals, that was a 4-win team. And they lost J.J. Watt. They lost Byron Murphy. They lost Zach Allen. They still haven't really. Maybe we'll see if B.J. Ojolari is good, who I like him as a bendy pass rusher, got multiple tools. He's a little bit smaller. You're talking about a guy who's probably going to be at least a double-digit sack guy, kind of similar to a Marcus Golden, while not being as stiff as Golden. A little bit less size and smaller. You kind of get to that same place as far as production, just in different ways. But you lose all those different types of players, and then you also lose your quarterback for who knows how long. And it wouldn't shock me if we are talking about the Cardinals with the first overall pick in 2024, unfortunately, because where this team is right now is kind of at the bottom, and they're on their way looking up. That'll be it for us here. This has been the Redbird Reboot, and consider yourself rebooted. Thank you again for joining in, everyone.